Peace, friends.
Peace.
Welcome. My name is Mikkel White. I am the pastor of our South Lansing campus of Sycamore Creek Church. Joining me hosting this morning is Nancy Dietrich.
Hello.
You show up in lots of different places. You are like a volunteer extraordinaire.
What? Thank you. It is my blessing to serve, and I get to serve with the most amazing people.
Oh,
so it's like,
yeah.
it's very selfish, honestly. So.
So we have a shout-out question for you this morning. Do you like to garden? And if you do, what do you like to plant? What's your favorite thing to grow? Flowers.
Oh.
Weeds. Okay. Well, you know, it's about that time to start thinking about it. Probably it's late, I guess.
That's right.
I like to garden. I like to pretend to garden. But
I'm not.
I'm usually a little bit late on it. So hopefully things will start growing soon and we can all enjoy the nice spring weather. All right. Join me in standing. We've got a couple of great songs this morning. All right, Nate.
Good morning, church. It's so good to be with you this morning. So we've been singing this first song, Glorious Day, a lot through this series as we've been talking about coming out of caves. And as you sing it, feel free to really think through like the experience of the words that are being sung and how that might resonate with your own experience or with the experience of others you know. But let's join in and sing this together. I was buried beneath my shame. Who could carry that kind of weight? It was my tomb till I met you. I was breathing but not alive. And all my failures I tried to hide. It was my tomb till I met you. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. Yeah. Now your mercy has saved my soul. And now your freedom is all that I know. The old made new, Jesus, when I met you. Oh, one day you called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. I needed rescue, my sin was heavy. The chains break at the weight of your glory. I needed shelter, I was an orphan, but you called me a citizen of heaven. When I was broken, you were my healing. Now your love is the air that I'm breathing. I have a future, my eyes are open, 'cause when you call my name, I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, into your glorious day. Yeah. All right, this next song we did with Jacoy, he led us through it. It's called You Made a Way. And it's such a powerful song because it tells a story of how we didn't see how God was going to do it, but yeah, he showed up and he did it. And I think that so many of us, when we reflect on our lives, can see that. And it's beautiful and it's terrifying and it's glorious. So let's lean into this. It may feel new, and that's okay. There's lots of stuff that feels new, but it can feel really good to sing about these truths together. Standing here, not knowing how we'll get through this test, but holding on to faith you know best. And nothing can catch you by surprise. You've got this figured out, and you're watching us now. When it looks as if we can't win, you wrap us up in your arms and step in. And everything we need you supply. You've got this in control, and now we know that you made a way. When our backs were against the wall, and it looked as if it was over, you made a way. And we're standing here only because you made a way. And now we're here, looking back on where we've come from. Because of you and nothing we've done to deserve the love and mercy you've shown. Your grace is strong enough to pick us up, 'cause you made a way. When our backs were against the wall, and it looked as if it was over, you made a way. And we're standing here only because you made, yeah, you made a way. When our backs were against the wall, and it looked as if it was over, you made a way. And we're standing here only because you made. Yes, we're standing here only because you made. And we're standing here only because you made a way. 'Cause you move mountains, you cause walls to fall with your power. Perform miracles, there is nothing that's impossible. And we're standing here only because you made. 'Cause you move mountains, you cause walls to fall with your power. Perform miracles, there is nothing that's impossible. And we're standing here only because because you made, yeah, you made a way. When our backs were against the wall and it looked as if it was over, you made a way. And we're standing here only because you made, yeah, you made a way. When our backs were against the wall and it looked as if it was over, you made a way. And we're standing here only because you made. Yes, we're standing here only because you made way. Yes, we're standing here only because you made a way.
Join me in praising God and thanking God for this team leading us in worship. Thank you, God, that you made a way. Go ahead and take a seat. Kids, go ahead on up to Kids Creek. We're going to have fun up there today. They were playing up there a lot this morning already, so I think the space is primed.
Yes.
For the children this
morning.
Energy.
The wonderful,
the energy
beautiful
is there.
energy.
That's right. All right, so when you came in, you should have gotten a program, and in that program is a connection card. Go ahead and write your name and your email address on that. Really doesn't matter if you've been here once or if you've been here loads and loads of times. Go ahead and fill that out. We'll let you know what to do with it later during our service, but if you are here for the first time and you fill this out and do what we tell you to do with it later, then you can pick up a free book that's in our cafe. It's on a little table in there. So you want to do this, I think.
Absolutely.
You want to do this, right?
And we want to connect. So
right. And another way that we connect here at Sycamore Creek is through the selfie ministry.
Yes,
so
yes.
Pull out your phones. I think I lost my phone. I don't know where it is right now. So, but pull out your phone and snap a selfie. This week's selfie of the week is my own kid, James. Last week, Nathan and I know, this is so sweet. Last week, my husband and I were not feeling well, and he and my daughter walked here from our house. We live here in the neighborhood, and they walked down by themselves, and he sent me this picture. So if you are on social media, go ahead and post it. Yeah, with the hashtag SCCMI. If you're not on social media and you still want to participate, you can send it to me or one of our team via Facebook Messenger or text or email. Really, sky's the limit.
There's another way to connect.
How's that?
In the chat. If you're online,
in the chat.
Even if you're here, you can get online, and while we're watching the message, I've done the online, and there's quite robust conversations going on.
Yeah, there's some good conversations in there. So
that is another fun way.
That's a fun way to connect. And that actually reminds me, one of the things that we do here at Sycamore Creek Church is we have discussion questions throughout our message. This morning, our message is going to be a conversation message, so it's video segments, and we'll pause partway through and have some time to discuss. So this is, you're going to participate today. This is, you don't just observe, you get to participate. So that's great. And one of the ways people participate is also by chatting online. So with that being said, this week we are wrapping up our series called Meeting God in Dark Spaces. We started this series on Easter, and today we're talking about the Cave of Grief. And our message begins with this. So Mark, we've been in this series on dark spaces and sort of dark caves, the metaphorical places that we find ourselves in. And so to talk about that, we've been talking about these literal dark spaces and caves that we've been in. And it's funny, a couple of weeks ago when we kicked off the series, I couldn't think of a time specifically for me, so I just used your story from Wind Cave.
That's amazing. You just borrowed my story.
Yeah, totally.
And
I mean, I credit it to you, but yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I've been in a lot of dark spaces, and I've had no trouble coming up with illustrations for this series. But I've talked to other people who've had the same thing. Like they were like, I've never been in a cave. I've never been in a mine. Other people, maybe it doesn't even sound good to go in those places. Have you been able to think of anything, like any dark spaces that you've been in?
Yeah. Well, it was funny. I went home that afternoon, and my husband reminded me that the summer that we met on a mission trip to Romania, and it was sort of like a few days before we went to Romania, we went to Paris for team building training, stuff like that. And we went to catacombs in Paris, and so we're under the city, and there's,
dark spaces.
It was a dark space.
Yeah.
But as I was thinking about it, I thought of like roller coasters are a place that I remember being in, like a really dark place. You know, you're outside and it's sunny and bright, and then you go into a tunnel and it's pitch black. You can't see anything. Nothing's like, you can't tell what's going on. And my favorite one is this roller coaster in Busch Gardens in Williamsburg, Virginia. And it's one of those that like starts you and it just shoots you off like a rubber band.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
Yeah. And
0 to whatever.
0 to 60, 0 to 100, whatever, I don't know. And this one goes into a tunnel and stops. And I was expecting it to just shoot us out from there. And instead, it dropped us. Ooh. Like a dead drop. I have no idea. 10, 20, 30, I don't know how. I don't know. But like, it's so surprising that all you can do, like all I could do was just laugh and shock the rest of the ride. It was so fun.
It sounds like you enjoyed that. I've been hearing lots of dark spaces stories from people, and one person was like, this series could be done anytime. Like, I'm not a fan of dark spaces, don't like caves, don't like mines, don't like cramped, dark, can't predict where it's going spaces. And they were like, anytime this series is done, like, that'll be fine with me.
Well, good news for them. We're wrapping up the series today, the series that we've been calling Meeting God in Dark Spaces. And it's based on a series from Grace Church in Florida called Everybody Needs Some Cave Time. We started the series on Easter, and we've just been talking about all these kind of hard places that we find ourselves in. And today we're going to continue that series with by looking at a real life family who were friends of Jesus, and they had to confront the cave of grief.
So the story that we're going to look at, it takes place in the Gospel of John. John is the fourth Gospel. And, these are accounts of Jesus' life and ministry. And in John's Gospel, he describes this family that Jesus has a relationship with. So there's two sisters, Mary and Martha, and their brother Lazarus. And John likes to write throughout his Gospel about love, and it's very clear that Mary and Martha and Lazarus are very dear to Jesus. He enjoys spending time with them. He goes to their house a lot. And it seems like spending time with them was a place of relaxation and restoration for him. It's a place where he could sort of unwind and spend time with good friends. So one day in John, Jesus is teaching, and he gets this message that from Mary and Martha that their brother Lazarus is sick. And Jesus gets this message, and he doesn't drop what he's doing. He just continues doing what he was doing. He continues teaching and doing his public ministry. And then, after a couple days, he begins his journey to Mary and Martha. And when he begins that journey, one of the things that John makes clear is he's going back to a region where he had faced threats before, and so he's going to go back to this region where potentially his life is at risk.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that John also tells us that Jesus already knows what's going to happen. Like, he already knows that Lazarus has died. In John 11:17, it says, when Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in his grave for 4 days. So one thing that's different about their culture than ours, one thing among many things, is that when people were buried, they were buried in caves. And so Mary and Martha are facing this literal cave that is representative of their grief and their personal loss of their brother. But it's not just a personal loss. There's also a very real sense in which their economic and social security in their community would have been threatened. Like they probably depended on their brother for that link into their community. And so this was a really big loss for them.
One of the other things that jumped out at me when you were reading that verse is the fact that he was in that cave for 4 days. For 4 days. That's a really important detail in the story, and part of the reason that's an important detail is something that we might not understand today. Had to do with the Jewish customs and beliefs of that day. And they believed that when someone died, their soul would still be in their body for 3 days, and then after the third day, the soul would depart. And so if you were to go to Israel today and you were to look at some of these ancient caves that served as tombs for people, you'd find like a little tiny opening where the soul was thought that it could escape from the body. That's
amazing. So this means the fact that Lazarus has been in there for 4 days. He's not just dead. He's dead. This reminds me of Miracle Max in Princess Diaries. There is a big difference between mostly dead and all dead.
All dead.
Lazarus is all dead. His soul had departed. There was no hope. There was no life. This grave became Mary and Martha's cave of grief. So all of us are going to encounter grief at some point in our stories and our journeys. Some of us might be currently grieving a loss, like the ones that Mary and Martha were grieving. And I also can't help but think about how, in the last 3 years, 7 million people have died from COVID-19. Just from COVID-19. I mean, it's a lot of people, a lot of lives and extended family who have been impacted by that loss. But death isn't the only kind of grief. It comes in all kinds of different shapes and forms. The loss of a relationship, the loss of a job, a divorce, a miscarriage. Even good changes can carry with them grief. Any big transition in your life is probably going to have some layers of grief to it.
Well, that's a really important reminder today.
It really is important. And I mean, I've experienced this in the last year alone. Even though I love Sycamore Creek Church, I'm falling in love with Lansing. Our transition here meant saying goodbye to a city that I loved living in. It meant saying goodbye to friends and people that I really cared about. There was a church that I was leading, and I loved the people that I still do love the people I was leaving. I had friends that I had to say goodbye to, and there was a lot of grief in that. Another way I've experienced that grief this year is I have an aging relative who's experiencing some mental decline, and the last time I saw her, she didn't know who I was.
That's tough.
Yeah, it is tough. And, my family has just been through so many changes, good and hard, that there's just been grief layered into that. So what about you, Mark? What places have you experienced grief over the last couple of years?
Well, I think, one place, grief literally over death, where we kind of started with this cave of grief related to death, is at the beginning of the pandemic, my grandmother passed away. And at the beginning of the pandemic, everything just shut down, and it was so weird. And so I can still remember we had a service for my grandmother where only a couple family members could be there. We were limited to 12 people or something. And so I was able to go and be a part of the funeral service, but my wife Jana and my kids weren't able to go and be a part of it. And I think over the past several years, and a lot of the experiences we've had of grief have been compounded by all the changes we've had to deal with throughout the pandemic. And I know for me, as a pastor, there's been a lot of grief in the midst of all the transitions. Okay, we can't do this, let's figure out how to do this. Okay, we can't do that, let's figure out how to do this. And there's been a lot of adjusting and kind of on the fly figuring things out. And it's been exhausting, and I think in the midst of all those transitions, there's a grief that happens in the midst of it that makes all of life more difficult. Now again, grief can come in lots of different forms, and it can be good things, good transitions that produce grief, where we're leaving other things behind. It can also be, the loss of a loved one, but just all these transitions, all these changes involve grief. So here's our first question for discussion today. Tell us about a time where you've experienced grief in your life.
Okay. Great. So, Mikkel, can I clarify something before I answer this question?
Okay. What's your clarifying question?
So, experience giving grief to others or experiencing grief? Because I got lots of stories there, I'm sure.
Yeah, I could share some stories of that too.
Okay.
Yeah.
So.
But more experiencing grief,
okay, well then
from
I
loss.
can go with that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's one of the things about grief that when you throw in like regret or guilt, it gets complex and complicated. And I was thinking of the time that when my dad was in the early stages of Alzheimer's, and then through that progression, the person he was not there anymore. He was gone, and it took a minute to realize that that grief process started there. Yeah. And it was very difficult. And then when he did pass away, then I felt guilty because I was actually very relieved. It was very difficult watching that. And then you're throwing in this guilt you feel because you're relieved and you're still experiencing the loss, which you've really been experienced for years at this point. And so it was very complicated.
Yeah, I feel like one of the most helpful things I learned about grief is that it's possible to feel two things at the same time.
Yes.
And you can feel grief and relief at the same time, and you can be celebrating new things and grieving what you've let go at the same time. And
it's like your new job.
Yeah, it's like the new job. Yeah,
exciting, but it's
there was some pain in that transition. Yeah,
for sure.
All right, so let's continue on with our next segment.
So I've been in the cave of grief in different ways and different times, and I think when you're in the cave of grief, you can't really help but wrestle with some loss, some confusion, maybe anger. There could even be a sense of like guilt of like what you could have done or what you didn't do, like that would have helped you avoid it. The cave of grief, it can be all consuming. But we have learned this truth, and it's helpful to remember it, that a cave can either be a hiding place or a holy place.
Yes, it can. And we don't need to add misery on top of our grief by going into hiding when we're in this cave. Grief is painful enough without us being isolated and hidden. And there's an important thing that we learned from Mary and Martha in the cave of grief that they find themselves in, and that's that Jesus can bring healing. Jesus can bring healing. And what makes our cave of grief holy isn't removing our pain or our difficulty or whatever we're facing. The absence of pain isn't what makes the cave holy. It's the presence of Jesus with us in that cave. And so as we continue through the story of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, we can ask ourselves this question about our own cave of grief, and it's, how can Jesus heal me? How can Jesus heal me in the cave of grief? Now, notice something about that question. It's in the cave of grief. Jesus doesn't expect us to pull ourselves out of the cave of grief and then we'll encounter Jesus in his healing. It's not like when we're in the cave of grief, we need to, just pull ourselves together, or, there's a purpose for this. We need to find the silver lining or whatever it might be. Jesus comes to us in the midst of our grief. He enters into our cave. He enters into our darkness, and he brings the light of his life into that cave.
That's really good news.
It is good news.
Let's talk for a little bit about what that looks like when Jesus goes into the cave. What is he doing? What is happening? How can we welcome him? So the first thing that we can talk about is that Jesus welcomes my confusion. There is nothing more confusing than grief and loss. It's disorienting. It can feel like the ground is shifting underneath you. What you thought was true, what you thought you had control over, has all of a sudden changed and shifted, and you have to kind of reorient your whole way of looking at the world in that moment. And we see this in the ways that Mary and Martha both respond when Jesus shows up. It says, when Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him. But Mary stayed in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask. When Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. So Martha rushes out to meet Jesus, and Mary stays back for a bit. And I think it's really interesting how the sisters give each other room to interact with Jesus on their own timetable and approach him at their own time. Grief, I think, demands really that we give space for different people to move at different paces and on their own schedule.
Yeah, they do give each other space, and eventually they both come to Jesus. And it's interesting because at different times they both come to Jesus and they say the same thing. Yeah. They both say, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, if we think about this, we think about their past week. They would have been sitting there with their brother Lazarus. They're probably, holding his hand, wiping his brow, and they're holding out hope. Lord, if only you would get here, we know that our brother will be healed. And you can imagine them sitting there and getting up to check at the window. And you can imagine them looking out at the path leading to their house. Lord, if only you would get here, we know that he'll be okay. And you can imagine them praying, Jesus, hurry up. Jesus, get here.
Where are you?
Get here, where are you? And then eventually Lazarus stops breathing. And you can imagine them thinking where's Jesus? He's not here. And then you can imagine, they put him in the tomb. They put him in this grave. And they're like, well, if Jesus can make it within the 3-day window, right?
Yeah.
Then we'll be okay. And day 1 passes, and Jesus doesn't come. And day 2 passes, and Jesus doesn't come. And day 3 passes, and still Jesus hasn't come. And that's a long process to go through. And you can just imagine the anguish and the darkness that consumed them at that time, the hopelessness that they must have felt. And I imagine they were probably questioning, this is what we do when we're grieving. They were confused. They were wondering, I thought we had this special relationship with Jesus. I thought he really cared about me. Where is he when we needed him? Lord, if only you had been here.
Yeah, that confusion, the confusion of grief, it causes us, I think, to search for those answers. And even to interrogate God, where were you? What I love about this passage is that Jesus seems to be welcoming of their questions. He's not shaming them. He's not saying, don't you believe? You should look on the bright side. Aren't I here? What are you talking about? None of that comes across. He just welcomes it. Jesus knows that the cave of grief is not a puzzle to be solved, but a relationship to be lived. And so it's in the security of their relationship, of Jesus' presence, they can ask those questions. They can bring voice to them. And I mean, I've found this to be true in my own life. I've discovered that Jesus is big enough and secure enough to handle my confusion. Like, I don't have to hold back or like be really careful how I word things or anything like that. I mean, I'm sure you know this, but there's a whole book in the Old Testament that's called Lamentations.
That's such a good reminder. Yeah.
And Lamentations, it literally means a passionate expression of grief and sorrow. Jesus is big enough to handle my passionate expression of grief and sorrow. Some of us, I think, need to get kind of messy in our prayers in the ways, in a similar way, I think, to the way that Mary and Martha do. Lord, if only you had been here. Grief is not the time for sanitized prayers. Grief demands that we get really real with Jesus. And in a way, I think honesty is the beginning of healing. Honesty is the beginning of our healing. And Jesus welcomes that confusion. So this actually brings us to our second question for discussion. Do you feel like you can be honest with God about what you're feeling? Why or why not? I'm just imagining the sacred conversations that you all are having right now, and I would love to hear your stories. We should get coffee, and I would love to hear your stories. So when you hear this question, what comes to mind for you?
I think I've gotten better over time, and maybe you get to be my age, you've experienced a lot of loss and grief, and you just start understanding that it is a part of life, and you're going to have your peaks and your valleys. Enjoy the peaks and re-energize on them, because the valley's coming, and you're going to need a little help climbing out of that. And I just think that the more I understand that rhythm of life that happens, then you can just get more honest. And to be, say, like, especially when loss gets stacked, you get your one event after another, you can't catch your breath. And it's like, God, I am not okay with this plan. I'm very angry. This is not okay.
It's enough.
To be in tune enough and feel safe enough in the relationship to really let your emotions out there.
I was thinking about this question, and like, I feel like I can be honest with God, but sometimes that first step is being honest with myself about what I'm feeling, and that can take sometimes more time. Or I can verbalize what I'm feeling, but then the emoting part, like I'll say, I'm really sad, and then it will take me weeks to cry about it. Like, there's sort of a disconnect between what my brain knows I'm feeling and what my body is expressing, and that, it just takes time.
Absolutely.
I think sometimes I just need like hours to just sit and then
to give yourself that time. Give yourself the time.
Exactly.
It'll come.
Yeah. All right. Let's continue with our message with this segment.
So we're going to find healing in this cave of grief, we're going to make it a holy place, not a hiding place. First of all, we need to realize that Jesus welcomes my confusion. But secondly, we need to realize that Jesus joins me in my crying. Now, this is an important thing. We have to think of this scene with Mary and Martha that Jesus is entering into as it was probably quite a bit chaotic. At that time, there were professional mourners. And so these were people who were hired to cry on behalf of the family. This is really hard for me to imagine as a reserved West Michigan guy. But what an interesting career, right? To make your livelihood weeping and crying and wailing. And John tells us that since Bethany is only 2 miles from Jerusalem, that many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. So Mary comes out of the house and she falls at Jesus' feet, and she's most likely, just weeping and crying as she does. And John says that Jesus looks around and he sees the scene, he sees all the emotion of it, and then Jesus wept. Whenever a heart is broken, whenever a grave is opened, Jesus weeps with us. The Jesus who laughs and who celebrates and is with us in the good times of life also laments and cries with us in those hard times that we experience. And unlike a professional mourner who's, they're probably faking it, right? Jesus really cares about this family. And so being fully human, Jesus feels the depth of grief the same way that we feel the depth of grief. And this reminds us that we need others to weep when we weep.
Yeah. I know that you've heard this story a few times, and probably other people have heard this story, but
it's still worth repeating.
Yeah, well, and there's an element to it that I think relates to this. 10 years ago, I had a miscarriage. A few months later, we tried again, and that time, it was a few weeks of like getting blood work done and tracking numbers of hormones and all kinds of stuff. And it was every time I would go in, it would be like, well, it's moving in the right direction, but not really at the pace we would hope, And so I had to keep going back and keep going back. And so in that waiting time, we invited some close friends to just be praying for us. Eventually, we realized that I had miscarried a second time. And I remember one of the most meaningful expressions of community that we experienced was a friend of ours who didn't live in the area called and left a voicemail. And she just said, "I am so sorry. I don't know why this happened." And we could hear that she was crying in her voice. And that meant so much. Like, just, I'm sorry, I don't understand either. And like, she's crying with us. It really, really went a long way to have people who were with us in that kind of a way. And Jesus does that too. He weeps with his friends. And I think he weeps with us too. And I wonder, like, why is it that, like, Jesus would do that? I mean, I think it's because death is not God's plan for us. Death is not part of God's good plan for us. And so when a loved one dies, when wars don't cease, when children are abused, when disasters happen, when injustice and oppression continue to murder people, our hearts cry out, it's not supposed to be this way. And I think Jesus agrees with us and weeps with us too.
He does. And in the midst of our cave of grief, Jesus comes to us, meets us there, and we can find healing through Jesus when, first of all, we recognize that Jesus welcomes my confusion, also that Jesus joins me in my crying, but then finally that Jesus offers me his confidence. You see, Jesus doesn't always just listen and weep with us. Jesus also takes action. And so Jesus is a wonderful counselor. He is also Almighty God, and death is no match for Jesus. And so what Jesus does, he gets there and he weeps, and then he goes to that grave. And remember, that grave has been sealed for 4 days. And Jesus says, "Roll the stone aside," Jesus told them. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, "Lord, He has been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible. What seems utterly impossible through human means, right, is made possible through Jesus. Jesus grieves, Jesus weeps, but then Jesus knows that he's God, and God has the power over death itself. So with a word, Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. His heart begins to beat with atrial and ventricular contractions. His blood begins to flow through Lazarus's arteries and veins. The bronchioles of his lungs begin to fill with air, and that flowing blood begins to pick up oxygen that oxygenates his blood, and it goes to his muscles, and his brain neurons begin to fire. His muscles begin to prepare to relax and contract. Lazarus is alive. It's incredible.
So incredible. I can't help but wonder, how this affected him for the rest of his life.
Yes.
Was he so much more confident, unafraid of death because he had already
He didn't have a near-death experience. He had an all-death experience,
He was all
like
dead.
you said.
Or maybe did Jesus' confidence become his confidence? His name means God helps. So maybe that was a reminder to him of this miracle for the rest of his life. But the thing about this miracle is that it points not only to this moment where Lazarus gets a new lease on old life in his body, but this event also points to Jesus' command over death itself, then and forever. Lazarus, he would eventually die again, right? But Jesus is pointing his followers to this reality that the finished work of Jesus on the cross and his resurrection, he's pointing to this reality that's to come of Jesus conquering death. And we just celebrated that at Easter. When Lazarus does eventually die for good, his sisters could trust that they would be with his brother in eternity because of what Jesus had done on the cross. The good news here is that death is not the end of the story. Whatever loss we're grieving right now is not the end of the story. We learned at Easter, the worst thing is never the last thing. There might be endings, within the story, chapters that are ending, but the story itself isn't over. And Jesus offers that confidence to us today. And there's one more thing that Jesus does. We've talked about how Jesus welcomes my confusion, joins me in crying, offers me his confidence. Jesus also extends to me his community.
He does. And, as this miracle of new life takes place, Lazarus is alive again. Jesus has instructions for all who have gathered there at that cave of grief. Then Jesus shouted, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. And Jesus told them, "Unwrap him and let him go." Now, the story continues. Lazarus is alive, and he emerges from this cave. And Jesus has instructions for Mary and for Martha and for all those who have gathered around. And it's unwrap him and let him go. And so following those instructions, Mary and Martha and everyone else there, they had to break Jewish law because he's alive, but he has been a corpse, right? And they're going to go and they're going to touch this corpse of their beloved brother, their friend, and together in community they approach Lazarus and they unwrap the grave clothes from around him. Now, I imagine that each of those people who helped remove those grave clothes, and we have to remember, again, he'd been in there for 4 days, so, fluids had leaked out, and, the smell had to be really bad. And they're transformed, though, by this experience. There's this stink of death on the grave clothes, and yet here's Lazarus alive. And maybe they experienced in that moment the awe of Jesus' power, the hope that we have that death doesn't have the final word. And this is really powerful. Allowing others to care for us and to be with us is a really powerful thing in the cave of grief. So let's pause one final time and ask a question about our experiences of community. How have you experienced community in the cave of grief? Let's take a moment and talk about that.
they were there.
All right. Sounds like some good conversations again.
Always.
Yeah, we were just talking about like sometimes the tricky part of community in grief is being able to accept help or even like reach out to people and say, hey, I'm going through a hard time. Like sometimes it's we keep ourselves isolated from our community by not letting people into what's going on or what would be helpful.
Exactly. Yeah. What in getting, when you're supporting other people, figuring out what does support look like.
Right.
But when it's you, are you really good at letting people know what it looks like? And would it be helpful to bring a meal or do this? And, oh, no, I'm okay.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. It can be tricky. Community is messy, but it's so good and so important. And I hope that you, as you've experienced grief, have experienced community who has come around you and who have loved you in the midst of that.
And over time, that's what I've recognized is that, just embracing that. And I've gone through a lot of losses, but the more recent losses when I've been part of this faith community and the family, the friends, the co-workers, but this faith community has been amazing. And I've gone through a lot of losses without that. And I'm telling you, it's better doing it in community.
Thanks for sharing that. Let's continue on. We have one more segment of today's message.
So the cave of grief, it can bind us all in a sort of grave clothes. For a time and a season, I think this is a really good and important part of being in the cave of grief, of moving through grief. But I believe that there comes a time when Jesus will say, unbind him, unbind her, let's go. There's a time for everything, Solomon says in Ecclesiastes. There's a time to cry and a time to laugh, a time to grieve, a time to dance. And this journey that we go on from crying to laughing and grieving to dancing, it usually involves other people coming around us to help us. Now, there's no set timeline on this, so we shouldn't be rushing people through it. And don't rush yourself through it either. Stay present to yourself, what Jesus is speaking to you, what you're learning along the way. Jesus can heal us in our cave of grief, and he does so by welcoming our confusion, by weeping with us, giving us his confidence, extending his community to us.
Yes, so for each of us, I think there's an invitation. And if we're currently in the cave of grief, it's to receive Jesus' welcoming solidarity. Jesus welcomes our confusion, and Jesus weeps with us. Jesus offers his confidence to us in the midst of this cave and extends his community. And maybe you're not in the cave of grief right now. And for people who don't have that, that's great. But you probably know someone who is. And remember, you don't always get to the cave of grief through death. There are lots of reasons, lots of ways that we can get into this cave. And so if you're only on the outside looking in, I want to encourage us today, let's take our cues from Jesus. Let's welcome our friends' confusion. Let's not try to solve problems for them or provide all the solutions or answers. Let's not try to tie things up with a neat, pretty bow.
Right.
But let's be willing to let where we are be confusing for our friends and our family members. And in the midst of that, when we join someone in their cave of grief, let yourself be moved by the other person's grief. Weep with them when it feels right to do so.
Yeah, this is so powerful. You're talking about the ways that we can take our cues from Jesus when we're caring for our friends who are grieving. And the next one in that line, you talked about welcoming confusion, weeping with people. The next one is offering people our confidence. And this one is tricky.
That is tricky.
Because we don't want to bypass people's grief. This confidence is not confidence in our ability to erase the confusion, right? We're supposed to be welcoming the confusion. We can be confident that God is good even when things are hard.
That's such an important point.
We can be confident that the worst thing is never the last thing, even when the worst thing is really, really hard. And we can also extend our community. So, if it makes sense to mobilize people to care for your grieving friend, do it. Put together a meal train. You might sit vigil with them. Call your person who lives near them, like take them out to coffee. There's all kinds of ways that we can come around them. Sometimes extending our community can just mean that you show up for them, that you make space for them, that you sit with them.
And if today you're sitting listening to this message and you are not in the cave of grief, that's really amazing. And if you are thinking, I don't know anyone who's in the cave of grief, that's pretty amazing too. But I hope that you've taken note of what you and I have been talking about, because you are going to encounter the cave of grief at some point, like we all will. And I hope that we prepare ourselves for that experience and for those dark spaces and those dark times that we are inevitably going to encounter ourselves or through someone that we care about. And so today we've talked about this cave of grief and about the community that supports us in the midst of our grief. I want to close by just another reminder that this is really tough stuff. And it's tough to be in grief. It's tough to be in community with other people who are grieving. And so what we do as a community is we return again and again to Jesus. We'll do our best in the midst of this tough place in life. And hopefully we'll encounter God's grace in the midst of that. And our prayer is that we as a community would be a community who follow Jesus' example into the cave of grief and hopefully out of the cave of grief.
Yeah, I love that. So to close, I just want to share a prayer from Cole Arthur Riley. She is the creator of Black Liturgies. She's on Instagram. She's probably on other social media platforms. And she also wrote a book called This Here Flesh, which I highly recommend. I'm going to read this prayer from her to close. God who knows sorrow, thank you for being a God who is moved to tears. For in doing, you remind us that we can believe healing is coming and still make space to grieve what it is. Remind us that hope and lament are not mutually exclusive. We confess that we are at times threatened by sadness in one another. We rush to resolve it. Grant us companions capable of remaining with us in our sadness. Not so they can speak platitudes over us or try to drag our souls toward happiness, but so they can hold space for our pain, reminding us that our stories are not a burden. Help us to hold our tears as sacred, never being too quick to wipe them away or hold them prisoner, knowing that our freedom is entwined with theirs. Our spirit aches, but not alone. Lament is sacred, and I am free to feel. Amen.
I hope that you're feeling an invitation this morning to explore your cave of grief or be with someone in their cave of grief. And we learned this morning that a key part of this, of turning a cave into being a holy place, involves connecting with community while we're in the cave or extending our community to other people who are in that cave of grief. And so the next part of our service this morning is going to offer some opportunities for you to connect with community, for you to connect with us. We would love to connect with you as well. So check out these opportunities.
Let yourself relax into connection. Find peace with meditative imagery announcements. Picture yourself lifting up a pen or going to sycamorecreekchurch.org/connect. Visualize your information connecting you to others as you form deeper community. Your spirit is a bright light in a cave of darkness. That light overflows into next steps, whether that's exploring your own cave of grief or inviting someone to one of our events coming up. That light turns into the summer sun, warmth, growth, connection. Summer groups and events begin next week. Plan to join a group to grow and connect and serve this summer. Take a deep breath. New things are coming. like what community theater groups in Lansing will be calling Sycamore Creek Eastwood their home. Join the press conference release Thursday, May 4th at 9:30 a.m. And exhale over a good cup of coffee or tea with Pastor in a Coffee Shop, Thursday, May 4th at 2 p.m. at Blue Owl in Rio Town. As you find peace, mark your calendar for Sunday, May 27th for a cross-campus Memorial Sunday worship in the Potterville campus yard. Join for worship and a meal afterward. There will be no other services at either of our other campuses. As we come to a close, we thank you for your generosity and your giving that makes everything here possible at Sycamore Creek. You can give at the blue buckets at your seat at sycamorecreekchurch.org/give through mail and many other ways. Thank you for taking this peaceful announcement journey with me. Let's take it back to worship to celebrate all the things your giving has made possible and have peace.
Oh, give it up for Carola. We love being creative here, and having creative announcements is a fun way to engage. As she said in the video, make sure you fill out your connection card, drop that in the blue bucket. If you drop it in the blue bucket and it's your first time here, you get a free book. It's in the table in the back. And I also wanted to make sure everybody knows you have an opportunity to take a risk at a potluck. You can take a risk on homemade food or play it safe with something store-bought. We're having a potluck on Memorial Day at the Potterville campus. Do not show up here or you will be left in the cold. Hopefully it'll be warm, actually, but there will not be any services here on Memorial Day Sunday. So go to Potterville, hang out with us. It'll be great. We want to celebrate our giving. Your giving makes lots of things possible. And one of our values is to be creative, and even creative in the use of our building spaces. So once a week, we have a craft group that meets downstairs in our building. When Peppermint Creek Theater Company is preparing for a show, they meet here to rehearse almost every day of the week. So it's really common to show up here in the evenings and there's like cars in the parking lot because our buildings are being creatively used for community groups and events. So thank you for giving. Thank you for helping make that possible. I needed to channel the announcement video and have just another deep breath. All right. Ice cream shops are opening up. What is your favorite flavor of ice cream? What do you go to? What'd you say? Michigan Pothole? I have never heard of that. Chocolate cookie dough. I like stuff that has like chunks in it, like whole brownies or like cookie dough. That's my jam. Chocolate, double chocolate. Okay. Yep. All right. So maybe that's a community event for the future is you go with some friends to, get some ice cream. But for now, stand with me. We've got one more song to sing.
Letting go of every single dream, I lay each one down at your feet. Every moment of my wandering never changes what you see. I've tried to win this war, I confess. My hands are weary, I need your rest. Warrior, king of the fight. No matter what I face, you're by my side. When you don't move the mountains, I'm needing you to move. When you don't part the waters, I wish I could walk through. When you don't give the answers as I cry out to you, I will trust in you. is you know what tomorrow brings. Got a day ahead you have not seen. So in all things be my life and breath. I want what you want, Lord, and nothing less. When you don't move the mountains, I'm needing you to move. When you don't part the water, I wish I could walk through. When you don't give the answers as I cry out to you, I will trust, I will trust, I will trust in you. You are my strength and comfort. You are my steady hand. You are my firm foundation, the rock on which I stand. Your ways are always higher. Your plans are always good. There's not a place where I go you've not already stood. When you don't move the mountains, I'm needing you to move. When you don't part the waters, I wish I could walk through. When you don't give the answers as I cry out to you, I will trust, I will trust, I will trust in you. When you don't move the mountain, I'm needing you to move. When you don't part the water, I wish I could walk through. When you don't give the answers as I cry out to you, I will trust, I will trust, I will trust in you. I will trust in you. I will trust in you. Yeah. I will trust in you.
Thank you for joining us this morning. Let's join God in thanking God, or join me in thanking God for our musicians this morning. Yes, that's what I was trying to say. Yeah. All right. Next week, we are starting a brand new series called Lies My Preacher Told Me. All right, so we're talking about some of the mistruths that we have heard and learned about the Old Testament along the way. I hope that you will join us, and until then, be curious, creative, and compassionate. Be at peace.